Um, maybe I did when I was a kid. Anyhow, so I'm sorry we're starting 5 minutes late. I have a presentation that should take about 25. And I should start by giving credit where it's due. All the blame is to me, all the credit is to my co-conspirators, Mario Diani over there and David Noak back in the States. It's a joint project. For the first 10 minutes, I'm going to give you an overview of the different types of analysis that we use in policy, broadly political, the political questions that interest us, and why did we come to a tripartite solution? Why is it that we needed to somehow move on to tripartite networks? There's a book forthcoming with Cambridge next year. There's an article that we hope should be out by the end of this year. So there's multiple sources on which we expect to disseminate this. I should also say that this is the first time I'm presenting this specific material. And it is due to the strong persuasive powers of our organizers, because I would have preferred to present something that is not so much on the novel edge as far as we're concerned, me and my co-authors. So, why use social networks in the analysis of political agency and in explaining political outcomes? Now, a lot of these, the first 10 minutes, is in a sense a reflection. I'm quite lucky that I've been here for a couple of days and I've heard the debates that were waged, and in a sense I was able to inform this sort of background, the types of questions that you were asking the last couple of days, in a sense try to sort of put them in perspective as far as I could structure them, if you like. So we're in political science in general, we're interested in power. And in this case, we could consider that all power exchanges are embedded in some form of a contract. These contracts could sometimes are theorized as trust, they're theorized as hierarchies, power relations, all types of different things. But there are some form of contracts that are out there. And of course, once you have these exchanges, interactions, it's almost natural to get to the next step where you start conceptualizing them as networks. Very fundamentally, and a very important point, something that, if you like, tarnished the image of sociologists for a few decades, was the debate between structure and agency. In the early phases of network analysis, it was perceived as a structuralist approach. Well, my argument is that networks allow us to integrate structure and agency, because we contingently examine agents and structure. So if you manage to go beyond the agential approach and the structuralist approach, and in essence your network analysis examines them contingently, you've actually transgressed, if you like. You've gone beyond accounts of structure and agency. So, some, like Nos Contractor, have called networks the meso level. And is an alternative, if you like, an alternative interpretation, to say that we could look at networks as the level between the micro and the macro. Another reason for which political agency makes sense to examine political agency through networks is that agents, and I think this is the most interesting debate I've had I've been engaged with the last couple of years. I mean, obviously, it doesn't originate with me. Is that agents are constrained by the relations of those beyond the horizon of observability. Horizons of observability is an old concept invented by Friedkin 78, if I remember right. But it actually makes a very, very fundamental point. This relates to earlier debates here. Are networks a theory? Well, what an agent does is not just affected by who they're connected to, but it is affected by those whom they will not recognize as being connected to them. So in a sense, the structure of relations beyond even the immediate environment matter. And they matter fundamentally for outcomes, particularly when we want to look at environments like political environments where power permeates the environment, where the outcome depends on who has what power and how are they exercising it. The center of power could very well be, or epicenters of power, if you like, could very well be outside the domain of the agent. Yet the agent, through their cognitive social structure, would know who the powerful are. So actually, we need a complete comprehension of a network to recognize where power lies. And of course, network structure determines opportunities and constraints to agents, and of course, by implication, determine feasible outcomes. Now, I was meaning these slides to be a minute each, and I'm already on 3 minutes, so I'll speed up. An example, I just wanted to show you 1 mode, 2 mode, and then 3 mode to make the logical progression. What do we do with 1 mode? This is an example from a network of banking regulation, the Capital Requirements Directive. Actually, you could see this. I liked using this example here because this is work I did with a colleague called Lucia Quaglia, because this is the network of institutions, influence between institutions in 2005 when they designed the capital requirements regulations that, 2 years later, led to the collapse of the banking system. So this is a very interesting case study, if you like. Who was responsible? So if you wanted to point the finger at who was responsible, what we were doing here was we were looking at who were the main brokers, and if, for lack of a better word, or a better expression, I would say, well, it was the Germans, again. Because they played brokerage roles. Not by design, they didn't intend to destroy the system by any stretch, but they played the brokerage role between the fundamental institutions. So in other words, they connected the Italian, I mean, you cannot see here because it's not colored, but they connected the Italian banks with the French banks, with the Swiss banks, and they play the central role in the convergence of all these influence process. Now, the problem with this analysis is descriptive, even when we use ERGM models, which we have done. And the network is a product of actor interactions. And we, in essence, we can only look for influential agents. There's very little we can say beyond contextualizing it. So if I show you this without context, it wouldn't make very much sense. So I need to contextualize it. In other words, I need to triangulate with qualitative case study data for this network to make any sense. If I hadn't told you the case, you wouldn't know what to make of it. Another case, or if you like, the next step is to actually look at 2 time points. This is again a very interesting study, well, very interesting for me. I've published the first paper on this 2006, and I have another one I published one day, on the evolution of a network of influence on a very critical EU regulation. I don't want to give you too much context, but in essence, one of the fundamental laws of the EU regulatory environment was contravened because a couple of political entrepreneurs managed to change the frame of reference of the debate. That's all I have time for at this point. Which means that by looking at the evolution of the network, we could map what was the impact of these key nodes. We recognize them as political entrepreneurs, and we could see what was their position between time point 1 and time point 2, map this onto the policy cycle, and see what was their impact at the different level of the policy cycle as it was related again to the policy outcome, which in this case was a major change, a real shift in the way that the EU was dealing with this particular type of regulation. So in this case, the network is the product of actor interactions, where proximity signifies influence. And in essence, what I say here is that this is a proof of, the proof is often validated through the data triangulation. So again, we cannot on its own make much of the network metrics, even on an evolutionary account. What we can do for the same data, we can run a stochastic actor model. And in this case, the evolution now, the fact that we have data 2 time points, the simulation allows us an insight on the type of processes that impact the change in network structure, and can help us test sociological theories. In this case, we can test whether there's reciprocity, the degree of reciprocity here, or transitivity, and things like that. And this is as far as we can go with the simulation of I mean, it's not that this is I wouldn't call this a small step, but this is as far as now. Something I only interjected this because of the debates you guys had on innovation the other day. An incredible data set by Fleming, King, and Yuda started being published in 2007. Since then, they've published at least a dozen papers on it. They've mapped the complete corpus of US patents, and they geolocate them. They have an incredible data set, 2 million records, if I remember correctly, where they have a great range of attribute data, and they also have timestamps on each patent, as well as data on, of course, who co-signs the patent. And these networks are, in a sense, co-citation networks. So the networks they create, and they can geolocate them. So they say, well, Silicon Valley, for instance. Who works in Silicon Valley and how they generate innovation. Actually, you could probably say that this is better described as invention. But anyhow, how they generate innovation and where is it generated and how is it linked. Now, because of the wealth of data here, which is very rare, they can actually, in their claim that they capture the whole corpus, they capture everything. So in other words, the complete network, if you like. They can generate predictive models that use classic regression, panel regressions, and so on. And in other words, make these claims like what matters. I mean, I just put the obvious up. They have an incredible list of what matters. But skilled labor matters, venture capital availability matters, social networks matter, and so on. But this is rare. We never get these types of data sets, particularly in political science. So what are the weaknesses of one mode in explaining influence and political power? Now, influence is often diffuse and cannot be validly mapped. Problem 1. Problem 2. Influence in political networks is proportional to the status or the political capital of actors. Again, we now have an attribute, call it political capital, that's incredibly badly theorized, and one of the problematics, if you like, of our understanding of power. Now, I have a paper on political capital, but I haven't finished it, with a couple of colleagues at King's College London. And I hope to address that, maybe, who knows, let's finish it first. But I think this is a very important point, that the key element of power is missing. And this is missing in broader descriptions of power, and specifically in description of powers of networks. Now, political power does not have to be exercised to be present. So when we typically go and collect data about political networks, we say, well, who holds power? This is either reputational or by the action of we infer it by the action of the agent. Now, I do not need to do anything if I'm powerful. Famously, the Medici, well, according to Paget at least, were equivocal. They were not actually taking action. They were sitting back and being presidential. They were not actually known for their interventions. They were known because they could represent everything to everybody. So if you were actually attempting to infer that the powerful were those that were pushing affairs further, you would be making a mistake. And of course, the exercise of political power is not the only way actors become aware of it. Political institutions are relevant, and of course, models of network action cannot readily be incorporated to political conflict. That's another major issue. We look at these networks, and of course, I map a network with a density of 0.2, let's say. What is the rest of the 0.8? The absence of a tie does not necessarily mean a lack of interaction. It could very well mean a negative tie, or it could mean indifference. It could mean all types of different things. So, and to add on that, if you like, one of our problems is that it's very difficult to have network models to interpret that, to contingently examine positive and negative ties, if you like. There is an attempt by Smith et al. At social networks this year. It's a good paper, I recommend. And of course, Aura, Kathleen Carley's group, has attempted to do that to a point, but their sort of their models are, well, some of them are interpretative, but mainly they're descriptive models. Which brings us to two modes. For the sake of my own safety in explaining, I use work that I've done, but that doesn't mean that others have not done work on it. So I just make this caveat that this is just stuff that I've done, and it's easier for me to explain. Now, this is a big project called MetroNet, and this is one of 6 case studies on that project. The project just finished last year, and we're now producing the papers. And this is a Basel case. There's 300 odd members. There's 10 types of actors, 6 affiliation events. And there's Swiss, German, and French actors in this two-mode network. Now, what we were able to do by this two-mode analysis was to detect who were the global brokers. So by simple descriptives, we were able to identify global brokers, and this was our stage 1 into this exercise, into exploring the case study, so that we would know who we would need to interview first, who need to be our gatekeepers. So in that respect, this was just an exercise in attempting, so the two-mode analysis was an exercise in attempting to identify gatekeepers. And this is done, by the way, the beauty of that, if you like, is that it is done so we identify the gatekeepers without using researcher bias. 90% of studies you will see that identify gatekeepers are opportunity samples. I happen to think that you're important, I approached you. Well, we approached people that the two-mode analysis identified as important. And then we could sort of progress from there, if you like. Because there was a lot of talk on semantic networks, there's a paper that I'm very happy to report was accepted a few weeks ago on the motivation of social entrepreneurs that I did with a colleague, Susanne Vogel, in which we do a two-mode analysis of a small corpus of interviews, and where the two modes associate text units to concept categories. I'm just flagging it up here. I'm happy to talk about it, since this is what I'll be working on next month, actually. But I don't have time to go into detail. I'm just giving you examples of two-mode. what you can do, if you like. What typically we do with two-mode is a process called projection. And this projection and decomposition process takes a two-mode network and decomposes it to two one-mode networks. Now, I suspect, and I strongly believe that this is a very obvious case here. So, because I have a little bit of matrix algebra coming up, and I think maybe we should focus on that. I'm not going to waste a lot of time here. Well, SNA methods can analyze, in essence, the networks that are produced from this decomposition and treat them as, if you like, a separate, how should I put it in simple terms? Yeah. By decomposing, by in essence projecting, we can, as in this case, show which people belong to the same organization, or show which organizations share memberships, assuming that this was people and organizations. I'm happy to go back to it. But what I think is more important is what are the limitations. So for those of you that do network analysis, that's something you already know. If any of you are not sort of familiar with it, I'm happy to go back on question time. Now, the limitations of two-mode projections are fundamental, and they're multiple. First of all, in one-mode analysis, each tie is assumed to be created separately. And in a sense, a specific event is responsible for the creation of the tie. That's the classic sort of one mode. Now, this is not the case when we project from two modes to one mode, because we have multiple events that are responsible for the creation of a potential tie. This also infers limitations if we're trying to compare our network with random networks. In other words, if we try to do more sophisticated statistical analysis, like actor models, because in random models, in random networks, that contingency is not there. In a sense, the creation of the ties is presumed independent from one another. But this is not the case, and this is not the case on the conversion from the two mode to one mode. Okay. Now, the projection of networks also tends to have larger, fully connected cliques. You saw the two-mode network I showed you earlier was very dense. By comparison to the semantic one, was not. But anyhow, I don't want to go into that now. And this creates bias, particularly in all the sort of standard measures of descriptive network analysis, which is the triadic measures and measures of structural Hall estimates, for instance. Because we have density that is not, if you like, within inverted commas, normal. This is not what we actually observe in real networks. So the conversion creates density that is not observed in the cases where we've actually even observed people interact in anthropological terms, if you like. And of course, there's information loss. The conversion from two mode to one mode implies information loss. Which brings us to three mode. And I'm hopelessly over time. Can I take 10 minutes to finish? By this time, I should have finished. I'm terribly sorry. So, three modes. Now, we base this, myself, David, and Mario, based this on an earlier paper by Ferraro and Dorian in '84 that was more or less ignored. And they did three-mode analysis involving tripartite networks, where the assumption is that any entity, that could be persons, groups, departments, organizations, whatever, can be related to another entity with a very basic limitation. The limitation was that ties between entities were not allowed. So you can only have within, so ties within groups, sorry. Ties within groups are not allowed. So you can have ties between groups, but not ties within. And we thought that this is a good way of actually looking at progressing, if you like, beyond that basic restriction and somehow add to it an analysis that would infer some core periphery. So how does it work? The restricted three-mode networks allow ties only between two pairs of three types of entities, and the inclusive, if you like, tripartite nets allow ties between a third pair. So that's our insight. For instance, an example of from social media. Social media tagging creates three-mode networks because we have networks between users, tags, and blogs. It's a classic case. And of course, we can use SNA to do this as a 3, 2, or 1 mode analysis. Now, we use the labor policy domain data, one data set on which David has published extensively, the famous book from '96, plus a few articles. This actually links, in this case, we have 95 private sector organizations, that we call P1, 22 government agencies, and 25 policy events. Now, the assumption is that the private organizations should not, on this type of analysis, should not interact with government directly. They should both have an interest in events, but not, but they shouldn't be directly interacting. Yeah, I mean, forget the hypothesis. So this is the matrix form, and this is the matrix form for the restricted three-mode, where, as you can see, the government to private and event to event is actually eliminated as a possible interaction. And this is what the private organization's interest on events look like. This is what the private organization interest, sorry, that's the wrong code, private organizations. And this is what the public, sorry, this says private up here, said public. I shouldn't be writing my slides at 3 in the morning. Apologize. Notes to self. Now, the pre and post multiplications of the matrix and its transpose, revealing direct connections among entities. And in other words, we extend the model to say we allow for what we know happens in real life, which is influence between the private and the public sector. So we have the original model that does not allow that, and now we somehow relax that to create a new set of, if you like, a new matrix, what we call C. Let's call it corruption matrix. So the interorganizational communication of policy information between private and government organizations, that creates, in other words, a 3x3 depiction of the two modes, which we can raise it to multiple powers, as you can see there, to measure path distance. This is sort of a very sort of simple standard matrix algebra. Now, once we come to this, we then can apply core periphery algorithms to determine a new type of core periphery. Of course, as I said before, we hypothesized these are prevalent in policy networks, core peripheries, and Laumann and others. Now, this new core periphery allows us to identify a structure that can be found by twice partitioning a two matrix of organizations by events. In this example, elite organizations are interested in both types of events, but non-elite organizations are really fragmented. And you see the partition here. If you see the, if you like, the hypothesis of density would be that the density of the core would be 1, and of course the peripheral densities would be between 0 and 1, and so on. And you see that the model actually that the data rather fits the model in that we have core organizations and core events. We have, and that peripheral organizations or peripheral events take a lesser role. So we can actually now start developing a more sophisticated theory of how these organizations relate to these events. Which brings me to my last couple of slides. You'd be happy to know. First of all, why bother? Actually, every time I'm listening to anybody's presentation, my first thought is, so what? So I try to say the same to myself. Why bother? First of all, political networks are volatile and often deal with intangibles, often have intangible resources in which they transact. And of course, political agency is embedded in power transactions, and these are difficult to capture. As I said earlier, power may exist without being exercised, and therefore any tentative capture of relations could fail to account for it. For instance, the more central actor might not be the most powerful. Now, networks of political agents are often purely cognitive. In other words, they can exist in the aggregate of the cognitive social structure of everybody involved. So we know who the powerful are collectively. And the powerful are not the ones that I think are powerful. The powerful are the ones that the majority of us think are powerful. This is a totally different conception of power. In other words, it is not what I think is powerful, or any of you think is powerful, but what we collectively think, or who we collectively consider as powerful. So agent networks can be particularly volatile around transformative events. Now, we tend to focus on one and two mode analysis on specific events, particularly one mode, obviously, where we assume that the network is somehow stable. But change could happen through what the economists would call a punctuated equilibrium. In other words, we could have a buildup of pressure that implies some inherent discontent in the political system, but nothing changes. Yet one event could break the camel's back, and suddenly we have a new configuration of power relations. Now, unless we contingently examine multiple events, we might be losing that. So that's why we should bother. And the so what? What can we do with three mode? Of course, we're still exploring it. And I should say, as I said earlier, this is the first time I present this, our three mode analysis. David has already done it a few weeks ago in Tilburg, and I'm not sure where Mario will do it, but he has to do it soon. What are further insights? What can we say? What can we claim? We can claim, or we claim, that we now have a more nuanced picture of core periphery. We understand core periphery better. By relaxing the Farrar and Dorian constraint on this theory of interpretation they have from 30 years back, our inclusive model allows us to focus on relations of interest. In other words, influence between, for instance, in this case, private and public agencies. We are partly able to deal with the problem of projecting from two mode to one mode, in this case, the problems of clustering and weighting biases of projection. Furthermore, we claim that, or I claim, I shouldn't put my colleagues in it. As I said, blame to me, credit to them. Relational outcomes are often confounded by the chicken and egg question. Are they antecedent or are they consequent to network structure? This is everywhere. Everywhere I see networks, everywhere I see network analysis, I have that question to myself. That's the first question I ask when I see somebody do a network. Where is the cause and the effect? Before or after? What is the claim? Now, multimodal analysis can maybe allow us for a redrawing of this debate. As I said, these are early phases. An analysis of agency and structure through a comparison of relations between entities rather than the relationships between agents also holds promise. Also, I consider of interest. I apologize, it took me 10 minutes longer than I intended. Thank you for your attention. Thomas. Questions, please.
I first got a question of clarification. I somewhat lost the logic in the end. Are you doing graph partitioning when you are analyzing the tripartite graph, or measuring centralities to address the core periphery question? Are you doing graph partitioning or community detection of a tripartite graph, or are you measuring centralities to address the question of? So it's partitioning. So then there would be a question. It is often claimed that even two-mode networks are perhaps not networks, but are closer to regular matrices. And here we have also three-dimension matrix or a tensor, and there are a lot of algorithms that could just do tree clustering without all instrument of graph analysis. What is the advantage of what you're offering, and how are you measuring the quality to capture this advantage in comparison to other existing algorithms? Or am I correct at all in understanding that you are trying to offer a new algorithm?
No, we're combining algorithms rather than offer a new one, and we're in a sense combining a method. I mean, obviously I didn't have time to go through detail here, and there's some elements of the analysis that I cannot divulge at this point before they're published. But the key element here is, and I think what makes a consistent story, is that we go from a three-mode analysis to a partition, so that the partition allows us to determine a core periphery on the basis of the three-mode analysis by relaxing one of the conditions of the classic Dorian and Ferraro claims about the relation between entities. So by making this very simple relaxation to the original model by Ferraro and Dorian, we are able to now produce a new partition. And if you like, to respond directly to what is our measure of is this partition better than another partition, for instance, let's say. Well, we cannot directly answer, because of course we could use alternative algorithms for the partition. In this case, we used, let's find the partition here. I didn't put it down. We used just the simple block model in this case. Okay, so this is a block model partition. But we've actually tried a few, and that's not the one that's going to be on the paper. But in this case, we use a block model partition. And I'm just giving the theoretical ideal claim, which would have been a density of 1 in the core group, and a density between 1 and 2, 0 and 1 on the peripheral groups, which seems to be contingent with our findings. That's what we would expect to find. That's more or less what we did find.
Thank you for a presentation. And the question is, when you talk about the different power of different agency and different actors of the political networks, have you done any indication of this power, of powerfuls?
With this type of three-mode analysis, one mode analysis seems to
Thank you.
Questions?
Should we take a break? Thank you. Thank you all.